Since 1916, the United States military has carried out the death penalty on more than 136 convicted criminals. But in the past 50 years, not a single execution has taken place. In this video, we take a closer look at the lives of 4 of the most dangerous inmates currently on military death row, men who are waiting for their final sentence inside a military prison. The stories behind them are as haunting as they are compelling. Welcome to Crimes Unearthed 911. 1. Nidal Malik Hasan. On November 5, 2009, Fort Hood, a major military base in Texas, became the scene of a brutal massacre no one saw coming. A U.S. Army psychiatrist, Nidal Malik Hasan, opened fire on his fellow soldiers, carrying out the deadliest mass shooting in the history of the American military. 13 people were killed, and 32 others were wounded. The attack shocked the nation and raised troubling questions about Hasan's motives, his mental state, and the deeper layers of ideology and personal conflict that led a military doctor to commit such a horrific act. Nidal Malik Hasan was born in 1970 in Arlington, Virginia, to Palestinian parents of Jordanian descent. After graduating high school, he joined the U.S. Army in 1995 and trained as a military psychiatrist, someone meant to help service members manage trauma and psychological stress. For 13 years, he served at various military facilities before being stationed at Fort Hood, where he was assigned to a behavioral health center. But it was there that Hasan's story took a dark and disturbing turn. In the months leading up to the shooting, Hasan began expressing increasingly radical views. He spoke out against U.S. involvement in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and became more isolated from his colleagues and superiors. Though his behavior raised concerns, no one fully grasped the seriousness of his psychological and ideological shift. Hasan had begun exploring extremist ideas and had even communicated with known radical figures, including Anwar al-Awlaki, a high-profile al-Qaeda leader. On the evening of November 5th, Hasan entered a processing center at Fort Hood where soldiers and civilians were preparing for deployment. Instead of being the doctor committed to their well-being, he pulled out a FN-57 handgun and opened fire on unarmed personnel. The attack was sudden, calculated, and cold. Victims were caught completely off guard. Many had interacted with Hasan just hours or days before. After killing 13 and injuring 32, Hasan was shot, subdued, and taken into custody. In the aftermath, investigators and the public were left grappling with one key question: why? Was this the act of a mentally unstable man, or was it a deliberate attack fueled by political and religious ideology? Evidence revealed Hasan had expressed deep dissatisfaction with U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. His email correspondence with al-Awlaki further raised red flags about possible radicalization. Still, no direct link to a terrorist organization was ever confirmed. Hasan's life and actions were analyzed from every angle, from his personal grievances to his growing extremist beliefs. But in the end, the motive remained murky. He wasn't considered legally insane. On the contrary, he appeared to understand exactly what he was doing, and why. In 2013, Nidal Hasan was tried in a military court and sentenced to death. He was convicted on 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder. Throughout the trial, Hasan showed no remorse, and the evidence pointed clearly to a planned, ideologically driven act of violence. As of March 2025, Hasan has been imprisoned for 15 years and 4 months. He is currently on death row at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, awaiting execution. Hasan's case is a stark example of how personal turmoil, religious extremism, and political ideology can collide in a single, horrifying moment. 2. Hasan Karim Akbar. On March 22, 2003, at a military base in Kuwait, as the assault on Iraq was about to begin, a brutal act occurred that would send shockwaves through the U.S. military. A soldier, a fellow comrade whom others had fought alongside, turned his weapon on the very people he was once tasked to protect. Grenades were thrown into the sleeping quarters of officers and soldiers, killing 2 senior officers and injuring many others. This attack wasn't carried out by an external enemy, but by one of their own, Hasan Karim Akbar, a former soldier in the U.S. Army. This story is shocking not only because of the brutality of the attack, but also because of who the perpetrator was. Hasan Karim Akbar, a Muslim American soldier, carried out this act the night before the Iraq War officially began. Colonel Philip R. Lenz and Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey R. B. M. Proctor were killed, and several other soldiers were seriously wounded. But what makes this case even more complicated and puzzling is Akbar's motive. Why would a soldier, trained to defend his country, turn on his own comrades? Akbar joined the U.S. Army in 1995 with the goal of becoming an engineer. Throughout his service, there were no clear signs of significant dissatisfaction or psychological issues. However, when he was deployed to Iraq, underlying problems began to surface. Akbar expressed strong opposition to the war, believing the Iraq conflict was unjust and immoral. He felt that the U.S. military presence in the Middle East was an act of aggression that conflicted with his religious beliefs. His growing sense of disillusionment with the purpose of the war and the actions he believed were wrong ignited a form of extreme resistance in him. What makes the story even more complex is the possibility that Akbar had been influenced by extremist ideologies. As a Muslim American, Akbar began to adopt radical religious views, believing that the war was in direct conflict with Islam. Some investigators suggested that he might have been swayed by extremist groups, although there was no clear evidence linking him directly to terrorist organizations. Still, his negative views on the war and religious extremism may have led him to attack his comrades as a form of protest. Further investigation revealed that Akbar had expressed dissatisfaction with the war even before the attack, but no one could have predicted that this discontent would lead to such a horrific act. Akbar's story isn't that of a mentally unstable soldier, but rather of someone caught in internal conflict, someone whose beliefs about justice, ethics, and religion drove him to commit a crime. Akbar was arrested immediately after the attack and tried in a military court. He was sentenced to death for murder, attempted murder, and other charges. Throughout the trial, Akbar did not offer a clear justification for his actions. What was evident, however, was his profound dissatisfaction with the U.S. military's involvement in Iraq, which he viewed as an unjust war. However, the issue went beyond mere political opposition. Some believed Akbar had been influenced by radical Islamic ideologies, which he felt justified his actions as a form of resistance against what he saw as wrongdoing. This event serves as a warning not only about the dangers of discontent in the military, but also about the impact of extremist ideologies on soldiers. When a soldier loses faith in the purpose of a war, when the ideals they once served no longer hold meaning, and when religion and politics become intertwined, extreme actions can emerge. Akbar's story is a stark reminder of the importance of maintaining clarity in one's beliefs and responsibilities, especially in times when war and religion can strongly influence one's actions. As of March 25, 2025, Akbar has been incarcerated for 21 years. He is currently imprisoned at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison in Kansas, where he remains on death row. The attack by Hasan Karim Akbar is one of the rare cases in the U.S. military where a soldier not only betrayed his comrades but also turned against the very cause he had once sworn to protect. It's a story of resistance, extremism, and internal conflict leading to an unforgivable act. 3. Ronald Adrian Gray. In 1987, as the U.S. military was gearing up for international operations, no one could have anticipated that a criminal was living among them at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, someone who would commit horrendous crimes that would send shockwaves throughout the nation. Ronald Adrian Gray, a young soldier, carried out a series of unimaginable attacks. Innocent women, some of whom were simply walking alone in the isolated areas of the base, became his targets. He not only raped them but also brutally murdered them to cover his tracks, creating a string of crimes that would go undetected for a long time. Ronald Gray was no ordinary criminal. When he joined the military in 1986, he was trained with special combat skills he would later use to attack and evade detection. Through cunning tactics and cold-bloodedness, Gray committed at least 3 murders and numerous sexual assaults in a short period of time. Despite the shocking nature of these crimes, the truth about the perpetrator was not immediately clear. Gray's victims were mostly young women, often vulnerable and alone, walking around the base. To attack them, he exploited their isolation and weakness, forcing them into situations from which they could not escape. His murders and rapes were particularly brutal, and his actions were not just crimes of passion but a calculated campaign of terror to instill fear and panic within the military community. One of his most chilling attacks involved the murder of a woman, where Gray not only killed the victim but also committed other inhumane acts, making the crime one of the most gruesome in U.S. military history. Like many dangerous criminals, Gray couldn't avoid detection forever. Despite being meticulous in covering his tracks and moving stealthily, the relentless efforts of investigators eventually identified him as the perpetrator. After a series of investigations and gathered evidence, Gray was arrested and tried in 1988. The trial concluded that he was responsible for a series of horrific crimes that could not be denied. Ronald Gray was convicted not only of murder but also of rape and sexual assault. With a death sentence, he became one of the most notorious criminals in the U.S. military. His case shocked the nation, not only because of the brutal nature of the crimes but also because a soldier, someone trained to protect, became a monster who used military combat skills to attack innocent people. Gray's story serves as a grim reminder of the hidden dangers within the military, where a criminal can disguise themselves under the guise of serving their country. Since his conviction, Ronald Adrian Gray has endured a lengthy legal battle over the legality of his death sentence, but ultimately, he still faces the consequences of his actions. His story is not just about the crimes he committed, but also about the ripple effects they left on the military community and society as a whole. As of March 25, 2025, Gray has been incarcerated for 38 years and 4 months. He is currently held at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison in Kansas, where he remains on death row. 4. Timothy B. Hennis. On May 8, 1985, a brutal murder case shocked Fayetteville, North Carolina, when Catherine Eastburn and her 2 young daughters, Erin and Kara, were found murdered in their own home. The case quickly drew attention, especially in the military community, as the deaths occurred near a large military base. Investigators noticed that this was not an ordinary murder. The victims were not only killed but also subjected to brutal attacks before their deaths. Catherine Eastburn, the mother, was raped before being killed, and all 3 were brutally murdered in their home. Police immediately began an investigation, but the killer remained unidentified, leaving the local community in fear. Despite investigators finding some clues, the case remained at a standstill for months. The evidence at the scene was unclear, and there were no witnesses to provide specific information about the suspect. Even initial reports couldn't point to a clear direction, and the case seemed to fade into the background. However, after further investigation and interviews with people in the area, one of the main suspects emerged: Timothy B. Hennis, a U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Bragg, located near the crime scene. It was notable that Hennis had no obvious connection to the victims, but several testimonies and pieces of evidence linked him to the murders. While there was no strong physical evidence, some local witnesses suggested that Hennis might have been involved in the crime. With these leads, Hennis was arrested in June of 1985 and charged with the murders of the Eastburn family. Throughout the investigation, Hennis maintained his innocence and denied all accusations. However, based on unclear evidence and conflicting testimonies, the case went to trial. Hennis was sentenced to death in 1986 and placed on death row. From the time of his arrest to his conviction, Hennis continually called for justice, but for 3 years, the legal system had no opportunity to reassess the evidence and protect his rights. Things began to change in the late 1980s when DNA technology started to be widely developed and applied in criminal cases. Investigators realized that DNA could be the key to solving complex cases with unclear physical evidence. In Hennis's case, DNA samples from the crime scene were re-examined, and the results showed that the DNA recovered from the victims did not match Hennis's. This was a huge shock, not just to those involved in the trial, but also to those who believed in the original death sentence. The results proved that Hennis was innocent in this case. After 3 years in prison and an unjust death sentence, Hennis was released in 1989 and had his name cleared. People began to question the fairness of the legal system, especially when DNA technology helped reveal the truth. One big question remained: how could an innocent person be sentenced to death, and how many others have suffered wrongful convictions like this? Though Hennis was released and his name cleared, his story didn't end there. After his release and restoration of his reputation, investigators continued to monitor the case and reopened the investigation. In 2006, with advancements in DNA technology providing new insights, investigators decided to reopen the case. New evidence from the original case was re-examined, and once again, DNA from the crime scene was found to match Hennis. Using this new DNA evidence, Hennis's case was retried in 2010. He was convicted again for the murders of the Eastburn family and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of a new trial. This retrial stirred public debate, as the DNA evidence from the original case was once again used to support the court's decision. This led to questions about whether Hennis was truly the perpetrator and whether justice had been served correctly. As of March 25, 2025, Hennis has been incarcerated for 28 years and 9 months, from 1985 to 2025. He is currently serving his sentence at Coleman Federal Correctional Institution in Florida, serving a life sentence. We've now explored the stories behind soldiers facing military executions and the punishment they ultimately receive. Each case raises questions about justice and the military's role in carrying out the death penalty. If you found this video intriguing and want to continue following stories related to death row inmates and executions, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any videos from Crimes Unearthed 911. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.